Well, good morning, everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. We're having a great participation. Looks like our usual diverse international group here for our Q2 2022 economic update. We hope to give you a general overview of the key issues impacting the U.S. and global economies. We're focusing on the areas that will impact most of our attendees. Please note your questions. There will be ample opportunity in the latter part of the presentation to answer your specific questions. Thank you to several of you who submitted questions in advance, and we plan to address those when we begin the question portion of the presentation. So let's review a quarter of continued recovery, growth, change, and of course, uncertainty. So when we had our Q1 economic update a whopping 3 months ago, the US economy was beginning to slow down. Inflation was accelerating, and with 1/4 of negative GDP, we had a new item to keep an eye on, the R word, recession. We had unemployment continuing to hover at all-time lows. Everywhere you went, there seemed to be a help wanted sign. We still had low interest rates. Americans were working from home and the office. Church, work, and school were in person again. People shopped whenever they wanted to, and online shopping was still strong. They ordered from restaurants online, but were also dining in person. They sometimes wore a mask to go out in public. You didn't have to fill out a loan application to fill your gas tank. Wow, that was the new norm. As we've learned, not necessarily. Americans long for many of the pre-pandemic lifestyle norms: time with family, friends, travel, freedom, and of course, spending money. In case you missed it, yesterday the Fed raised their interest rate about 75 basis points, and this morning GDP was announced as a decline of 0.9%. So what does all this mean? Well, to help us figure all this out and develop a future game plan, I'm honored and pleased to introduce Patrick Gauthier, a senior portfolio analyst with CPS Investment Advisors. Patrick?
Good morning. I'm Patrick Gauthier, senior portfolio analyst with CPS Investment Advisors, and happy to be back here with everyone to discuss the happenings of the second quarter. So we'll dive right in. As everyone can attest, the stock market is down. No surprise news there. And even bond markets, prices are down and yields are up. So it was a rough ride here in the second quarter. Typical where we are in the cycle. You can say the market's getting a little bit ahead of the economy in terms of the market being down and the economy not necessarily showing all of those signs, but we're going to talk a little bit about that moving forward. So I'll dive into the S&P briefly and just show you that really no place to hide. If you look at the sectors individually and even go to the international market in the lower right corner there, there weren't very many good places to be invested here in the second quarter. So this is going to really highlight diversification, knowing what you own, owning quality companies that at least during times like these are going to keep sending you dividends. You're going to own things that keep paying you, things that run quality businesses. So through these tough times, even though the price of your business will go down, you can still be collecting a paycheck. But interesting to see when the markets move in concert like this. Really aren't very many great places to hide. So what is causing this? What's driving the markets down? There's a few key things that we'll touch on, but the highlights are going to be fear. Everyone is talking about that recession, as Marshall mentioned. Popular word, you've seen the headlines. There's a number of ways to look at it. But folks want to know if we are in a recession, how bad it's going to be, how long it's going to last. We'll talk a little bit about the money supply and inflation, and also a little bit about wages. So let's dive right in here. Something that you don't see a lot of press on is the money supply. And it's a very impactful part of our economy and part of the Federal Reserve toolbox, if you will. So if we circle back to 2020, we're looking at a pretty normal growth rate of the money supply. That does grow on average, 5 to 6% each year. That's considered healthy for the economy. But when COVID hit and all the stimulus came out, We took that money supply and we increased it by 30% in the matter of a couple of years. So pretty impactful, the amount of money that translated into the system. And let's take a quick look at where that money goes. Well, if anyone's tried to buy a vehicle in the last couple of years, you know prices are up. Used car prices are up because they are available. You can buy a used car and drive it today. New car prices are up simply due to lack of supply. You could buy a new vehicle and have to wait a while to receive it. It's interesting, in the last 10 years, house flipping is a very popular item for folks to partake in. We've even started to see some car flipping now. If you bought a brand new pickup truck and waited a month to receive it, you could turn around and sell it for more than you paid for it that same day that you get the keys. So didn't think we'd be into flipping new cars at this point, but it's kind of an interesting thing that you see out there in the economy. Well, that's one of the areas that, us as Americans, we're going to spend our money. We like our vehicles, we like them bigger and better, and we're not going to stop spending our money there. So prices are going to keep going up. Home prices as well. Info from the Fred database here. Average or the median sale price of homes in the U.S. is up to about $428,000. That's just the middle sale point. There's many, far above that. If you look back just a couple years, that's about a third higher than it was just a few years ago. So the COVID pandemic a couple of years ago led people to want to be home more. It opened up the door to working from home and spending a lot more time in your home space. And folks started to look at four walls day after day and wanted to find a better space, so they weren't afraid to bid up the price of homes. And mortgage rates played a significant role as well. When you can borrow at 3%, historically, that's a very good rate. The last place that stimulus ended, surprisingly, is the stock market. Folks were padding retirement accounts. Folks were putting excess savings in the market. We were out there spending our money at businesses, and the stock market is the reflection of business. If your businesses are creating revenue and generating profits, their share prices are going to increase. So a fair portion of that stimulus ended up in the stock market, increasing prices. I know we all have that friend out there. There may be a few of us on the call that opened a Robinhood account and did some trading of our own, with some of the excess money floating around. Nowhere else to spend it early on in the pandemic. So certainly a popular way to use your excess funds. And here we are with inflation. As Marshall mentioned, it's a big topic on everyone's mind. We've got the 9% number there, headline inflation. Looking back in the 70s and 80s, is history going to repeat itself? Are we going to go through a prolonged dozen-year period of high inflation? I'm hoping not, and I think there's some indicators saying we won't. We're going to dig into that, but we're close to it now. Luckily, the markers are telling us that inflation is beginning to slow. Just a matter of how quickly it slows is going to be the question. What's inflation made of? It's your prices, your consumer price index, what you spend your money on. So the two numbers are the headline inflation, the U.S. CPI in orange there at around 9%. And then you have a stripped out version is what it's referred to as. It's inflation less food and energy. Different economists are going to look at these numbers differently. I like to use them in concert to understand total inflation, but also inflation of those goods that aren't quite as volatile as the energy market. As we'll speak about moving forward, there's some problems around the world. Oil is always a big topic and who's in control of oil prices, but energy and food can be pretty volatile in terms of price. So that number of the price index minus food and energy is an important one to understand because people are going to spend their money in different areas. So has the music stopped? All that stimulus going into the system, all the spending packages and the student loan forgiveness and relief, it leaves folks with a lot of money left in their pocket. And has the music stopped? Will we find a chair to land in, or will we be left out of that, our favorite game of musical chairs there? Stimulus is winding down. So we see The spike in spending with the purple line, that was the stimulus packages again in 2021. When you hit the midterm election years, it's very hard to get a lot of those spending packages through. I know just recently we had one announced on climate spending, a far smaller number than some of the additional trillion-dollar packages that were planned moving into this year. So when you get towards the fall and those midterm elections, you know that things are going to get pretty tight in DC, that no one wants to really step out of bounds and put themselves on a limb when it comes to the midterm elections. So don't anticipate a lot of additional federal spending. One thing I like to highlight here is that orange line, and that shows you the lag that comes in CPI from that fiscal stimulus and that federal spending. So even if you put the brakes on the stimulus and all the federal spending right now, you're still going to have a delay when you see prices come down. All that extra money has to get into people's pockets. They have to be comfortable with spending it, and they have to go out and spend it in the economy. And then that gets back into more people's pockets through wages. So note the lag there. It's important to understand that it's not a light switch. It's something that you have to fill a bucket and empty a bucket, which does take some time. Interest rates, big topic of conversation this year as always. This is the end of the quarter yield curve, which I thought was important to highlight. So the blue line is last year's interest rates. The yellow was just the end of Q1, and that green line was the end of Q2. If we had populated that this morning, that green line would be 75 basis points higher on the short end. So what does the yield curve tell us? It tells us a couple things. It tells us what the market expects out of inflation over the long term. So when you go out 10 years on that scale on the bottom, that's the number that the bond market uses to predict inflation long term. And we're still seeing it in the 3% range, which is an indicator that the bond market believes inflation will come down and be more moderate moving forward. That's a good sign. I'm happy to see that the bond market isn't demanding 9 or 10% interest over 10 years. That would let us know that they don't feel inflation is going to come down. That would lead us down a much different path. There are other areas where the yield curve shows up for consumers. One of the major areas is going to be mortgage rates. Mortgage rates 5.5 at the end of the quarter. You're going to see them north of 6 with the latest rate hike. It makes it difficult for your average home buyer to go out and borrow near $500,000 at 5.5 and 6%. It's not as easy to make that monthly payment as it was at 3%, as we've had over the last few years. So where you're going to see this translate into the economy is home sales will slow. They're not going to plummet. This isn't a repeat of 2008 by any means. The structure of the housing market is far different than it was at that point. But you will see houses on the market longer. You will see price decreases in pockets of the country. But there's an underlying equity in people's homes. A lot of folks have their mortgages locked in at a very attractive rate, and they're not going to be in a hurry to go spend twice as much in interest on the next house. So not thinking that the housing market's going to crash, but you will start to see that slow down dramatically as affordability comes down. And wages. How are wage increases affecting your average spender? On the left, we've got your average hourly earnings. That's a very good looking chart. It's nice when people have more hourly earnings. Everyone's happy about making more money. But you do have to adjust it for high inflation numbers. So it doesn't look as pretty with the chart on the right. Your real inflation adjusted average hourly earnings are down from where they were a year or two ago. So when we circle back to that affordability conversation, if you're not bringing home as much money in real terms as you were a couple years ago, your car payment's higher than it was, your mortgage on a new home is higher than it was, that is going to leak into affordability of some of the other goods that you can go without. Couple that with oil and energy prices and food prices rising, that's where our American consumer that has been so strong over the last 10 years is going to start to see some trouble, and they're going to have to make real decisions on a household basis as to, do we vacation, do we go to that theme park, or do we make sure we've got money in the bank to cover our food and our gas moving forward. And looking at housing affordability is, those ingredients that we talked about, what goes into the affordability factors. It's an interesting way to compare it to what we've been through in the past. The 100 level that you see at the bottom of the chart there is really just the median income family being able to afford the median priced home in their area. So over the last 10 years, it's been very affordable. The higher that number goes, the more affordable a home is. We're back at affordability levels that we haven't seen since 2006. We are there for different reasons. I want to make sure we're all on the same page there, but we are back at those levels, so it's going to affect spending in one way or another. As always, we're going to remain positive. We are optimistic about stocks. You may look at the headlines and look at charts of the S&P and say, Pat, you're crazy. Why are you positive on stocks? So let's talk a little bit about that. Some of the indicators are pointing to optimism moving forward. Consumer sentiment on the left there, we are at lows in consumer sentiment, basically since it's been tracked. Typically, consumer sentiment hitting that 50 range in its measure is a low point in most recessionary periods. We're looking at bear market territory for the Dow. The S&P did dive into a bear market earlier this year, and the NASDAQ got there very quickly this year as well. So as the market moves in cycles, we know that these things tend to rebound. When you talk about the consumer, they figure out a way to organize their budget. And when the cycle turns and the Fed starts to decrease rates, they've got more money in their pockets and they'll go out and spend again. The big question is how long it takes to get to that next part of the cycle. So some of these indicators are pointing towards the fact that most of the bad news is already priced into the markets, and we're starting to see that show up as far as when you poll consumers. A lot of you may have seen this chart before. It's something CPS refers to on a regular basis, and really we want to reiterate the idea that this happens. This is no surprise. Most of us have lived through a number of these episodes. The market has average drops of 14% on a regular basis, and even with that, annual returns are positive 3 out of 4 years over the long term. So we can point back, which I believe Marshall is going to allude to a little later on. We can point back to these years and pick out some very disturbing reasons that you wouldn't want to buy stocks, but in reality, this is the time to buy. There was an old saying in the business I was in that when your customer's mad and they want to throw a brick through your window, you tell them to attach a check to it, because when you're that mad about the markets, that's when you need to be buying stocks. And I take that to heart. When things are down and everyone's scared is the best buying opportunity you're going to get. And we'll leave with Warren Buffett. He's noted for being greedy when others are fearful. And when everyone else is greedy, he's not quite as greedy. You've watched him as a money manager sit on the sidelines with cash for a number of years and collect a lot of criticism for that. Folks, say as a money manager, you need to get your money invested. Well, just because everyone else believes things are worth a certain value, that doesn't mean you have to. Right now, everyone is believing that stocks and investments are not worth what they were last year. History tells us 10 years from now, they'll be worth a lot more than they were last year. So it's a great time to buy things at a discount. So I'm going to turn it over to Marshall, and he's going to move things forward for us. But I will be around for Q&A, so happy to help out if that sparked any questions for anyone.
Thanks, Pat. Appreciate it. Well, everyone, Pat always gets us into the market. I try and get you down into the dirt a little bit in the general economic conditions. So let's talk about those. Obviously, as mentioned, inflation is high. There's no question about that. We are going to talk just how high it is in a few minutes. We've got the geopolitical tensions of Russia versus the Ukraine versus Europe. You didn't think Europe was in the middle of that, whatever you want to call it, between invasion, Russia versus Ukraine, but economically, they're in the thick of things. Interest rates, they're still low, but obviously moved up yesterday, 75 basis points. And so we want to recognize that. We'll talk about it. Unemployment, historic lows. Demand is still high, but it is beginning to wane a little bit. And COVID is present, but not a clear and present danger. I was intrigued to find out another senator who was at home recovering from COVID yesterday. I'll mention him in just a few minutes. The number of people who are having it, but of course, it does seem that it's less severe when people do get it. And I think we're just becoming accustomed to the fact that it's a part of everyday life, and you continue to do the things, wash your hands, and do all the things to try and minimize your chance of getting any of the various strains of COVID. GDP. Well, here was the hot information this morning on GDP. We're all sensitive to that. In case you missed it, the market was down 0.9%. I show this to you on purpose because I wanted you to reflect back in 2020 when GDP was down 3.5%. And I wanted you to take a minute to reflect back to your own finances, to your own portfolio, and remember how terrible it was in 2020 at a negative 3.5. And I'll give you half a second to do that. And you're probably sitting here going, wow, I don't really remember that being that bad, but I guess we must have gone through it and we survived. Well, we're down 1.4, 0.9 so far this year. So that's about 2.3 in the scheme of things. And as a result, we're part way to that 3.5. The whole thing is it horrible? It is, well, it might be a recession. And let me address that. You know, there's the old joke, what's a recession? Well, a recession is when your neighbor loses their job. Well, what's a depression? Well, that's when I lose my job. So it's an old joke, but I couldn't resist throwing it in this morning. When I went and took Economics 101 back at JU, Professor Boyd McDowell sat there and he taught us that a recession was 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. All right, so let me drop back over here. We've had 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP, and that information came out this morning. I tell you that because there's one other thing when you know you're in a recession, and it's when the National Bureau of Economic Research says you're in a recession. So I guess from a societal standpoint, you're really not in a recession until the National Bureau of Economic Research says so. Well, again, that was an old definition. We found out last Sunday on Meet the Press from Secretary Janet Yellen, and I'm now referring to this as Yellenomics so that you understand the source. And she told us that we are not in a recession, we're in a transition in which growth is slowing. So it's important that you get that. I couldn't help but have that same analogy that if I had come home in my dad's car and there was a dent in the door, and I'm explaining it to my dad, it's really not a dent. It's just a transition in the smoothness of the side of the door. I don't think I could have sold that to him, but it would have been worth a shot anyway. Yesterday afternoon at the 2:30 conference meeting, Chairman Powell says we're not in a recession. So I guess if Chairman Powell was quick to remind us that many times the initial GDP numbers get revised. So I guess it isn't so until he says it's so. But whatever you call it, let's be honest, growth has slowed, which isn't all bad. The question is, will growth or lack thereof, what will that be like in Q3? Now, Chairman Powell also came out and said there will be positive growth over the full year. So I guess what I'm saying to you this morning is stay tuned. There's definitely been a slowdown. Now let's look at the traditional definitions in the business cycle, and I'm going to focus on the late section right here. In the late part, we've seen the expansion. Now we're into the late part of the business cycle, as it is referred to, and we have growth moderating. Well, this has been a huge week for earnings reporting. About 35% of the S&P 500 companies report, and we have such large tech companies that have missed both top and bottom line. We had several of them. Companies are beating expectations. It's mixed. but generally across the board, we're seeing growth moderate. Well, Feds raised the rate yesterday. Credit tightens a little bit. Earnings are under pressure because cost of borrowing's gone up and cost of raw materials has increased. The policy is a little contractionary. They're looking to contract. We have the confirmation that whether it's a recession or not, that things have contracted a little bit. Inventories are beginning to grow via a couple of reasons. Number one, ships are able to get in, the companies are able to get inventories, and with a little bit of sales growth slowing down, the inventories are growing. Now, that growing doesn't mean they're excessive, it means they're catching back up from the outages that we had in just very recent months. Now, the difference between that and the contraction of the economy, and then you can see at the top right that dreaded R word, recession, means falling activity. Now, is point 0.9 falling? You have to get your own definition in there. Credit dries up. Well, credit has not dried up. It's not even close to drying up, but it has been tightened. Profits are in decline. We're seeing more companies that, hey, they've declined. That doesn't mean they're losing money. It means they're not making quite as much they were during the rah-rah period of the recovery and this influx of cash the last couple of years. At that point, policies will begin to ease. Chairman Powell stated yesterday that we may be looking at smaller increases or possibly, ready for this, no increases in the coming quarter. It's up for grabs depending on what happens to the economies. Inventories rise and sales fall. This is the natural business cycle. For those of us who've been in business for a long time, this is how it goes on. This is how it gets done. So let's talk about what makes sense going forward. Obviously, inflation. It's on everyone's mind. I felt bad even showing this slide. If you don't eat or buy gas, you probably weren't aware of the inflation. I love how they have the two charts, and I love when Patrick shows this because we have the chart and we have the chart without food and gas. Now, I know most of the people, I think I know everybody that's on this presentation today, and I know that you eat and you drive vehicles. So we got a couple of electric vehicle folks there, but okay, you're using carbon energy to fuel your electric bill, and your electric bill's gone up because of the increase in energy costs. Everybody's getting hit with this. To what degree, it's going to be interesting. So where's it coming from? Wall Street, okay? Large corporations are passing this on. They find it easy to because in many cases, the large corporations, their customer is faceless. But the consumer is beginning to step back a little bit. We're seeing that in slight declines. Walmart came out with some interesting comments the other day, reducing some of their anticipated sales. We've seen them immediately afterwards come out with some good sale price numbers coming in. Target, some of the other large retailers are doing exactly the same thing. So the consumer's starting to step back and say, hey, you got to give me a little better price. Main Street, it's tougher for the small business because their customer isn't faceless. They're face to face. It comes a little more difficult to pass on the price increases. Pennsylvania Avenue, you're a vote. You're faceless. And the politics driven game that they have is only to win this November. Now that can be good, and I'm going to let you in on that in just a couple of minutes. Inflation, investing, defense. The question comes up, Marshall, where should I be putting my money so that I'm defensive on the economy right now? I'm being smart because of its inflationary period. Well, inflation favorable assets, we always know, is the market. It's one of the reasons Patrick's so high on it, one of the reasons we're so high on it. Precious metals, proceed with caution. They don't always do as well as you might expect in inflationary periods. As Kathy always reminds me, precious metals from a jewelry store are always a good investment. Real estate, you've seen what happened with housing prices over the last couple of years. If you were in that market during this inflationary period and you're selling real estate, wow. If you're just increasing your value in the portfolio, no question, that has happened too. And of course, small businesses. Where you don't want to be, or what's unfavorable from an inflation standpoint, the cash, the piggy bank, sock bank, and the bank of the mattress are not good for us. Um, Fixed income, we've got treasuries, CDs, and bonds. Those are all real challenges for us that we have to look at. Well, on the geopolitical side, let's get back there. Russia versus Ukraine versus Europe. Marshall, why are you throwing Europe in this? Well, what's happened is we have the concept of a truly global economy, and that's never been more evident since last February. The European dependency on Russian energy, on food out of Russia, food out of Ukraine, other products, coupled with the disruption of Ukrainian production, is just choking an already shaky Eurozone economy. And they thought Brexit was bad. This is real, folks. I mean, we're talking raw materials, we're talking food, we're talking energy. These are the basic necessities of our human day to day life. So, right now, Europe is in far worse shape than the US is at the moment. Interest rates, 10-year treasuries about 2.8% this morning, 30-year mortgages running about 5.6. As Patrick alluded to just a minute or two ago, your challenges here are we are pricing out the first time home buyer. I can't imagine being a first time home buyer reflecting on these mortgage rates, but at the same time, I have to reflect on 5.6%. And again, I know the demographic of many of you on the screen. And there was a time in our lives that if we could have gotten a 5.6% mortgage, we'd be doing backflips and somersaults. But the reality is, for the first time home buyer right now, the psychological aspect of that and saying, wow, I could have had 2 3/4 a year ago, and now it's twice that. Wow, I need to back down on the market and hope these rates come down. Will they come down or not in the short run? I don't know. I honestly think we're probably looking at these rates holding for a little while. And as the graph showed us, the market seems to think these rates are going to hold for a little while as well. So that means that first time home buyer can't afford that first time house, which means they're renters. And what have we seen in rental rates? Rental rates have been horribly impacted from an inflationary standpoint, but that's the price to pay if you want to play. So reality is these will have a slowing effect on the economy, whether that's a dent or whether it's a hard hit. I'm leaning a lot more to the dent. I think Secretary Yellen's telling us a dent. I think that Chairman Powell's telling us a dent, and the market seems to be telling us is a dent. So hang in there. I've got even more reason to tell you that it's a dent, and that'll come up in just a couple more slides. Help wanted. Okay, let's go back to 2008. Let's go back to some of the declines that we've seen in the market, 2000, et cetera. And in every case, unemployment was through the roof. We had horrible unemployment going on. And now we're sitting here that unemployment is a challenge from the other side. It seems like every client I talk with has the same mantra. I'm looking for more good people. An interesting one I ran into the other day was a conversation again about shortage of daycare workers. This has to be huge. And it's one that is slow to catch back up. It'll be interesting to see what happens when school starts. The result, workers can't go back into the workforce in many cases or stop working from home because of daycare openings. We had an interesting thing the other day. Google came out and said they're eliminating 57,000 jobs. 57,000 jobs. That's a decent sized city. And they're saying, well, we're not going to do that. But that was if you look at the numbers, if you look behind the numbers, that was their anticipated hiring for the year. If they don't fill those 57,000 jobs, they're right back to the same employment they had December of last year. So what they didn't get was this growth. What they're looking at are the programs. And when everything is rah-rah, you throw dollars at different projects that may or may not be viable. This basically says, hey, we're going to step back and we're going to make sure the things we have in place are going better. So we're stepping back on that hiring. Consumer confidence, it's shaken. It's always interesting because this time of year I get to see the news a little bit more because I'm not staying later during tax season. I have to turn it off. you got to turn off the news. I mean, you turn it on and immediately they start, wow, this is terrible, this is terrible, this is terrible. It's not. It's the normal course of things, and we'll get through this, but I won't be tuning back in at 11 to find out what's happened to inflation between 6 and 11. But consumer confidence is down. We're not quite as bad as December of 2020, but we're down. The consumer's concerned. They get it in their face every time they go to the grocery store. They get it in their face every time that um, they buy gas. So it's right there. But they have an unusual way of dealing with it, and that is they're reaching for the credit card again. We're not quite where we were pre-pandemic, but we're starting to see credit card balances rise. Leading economic indicators, these too have slowed down, and this is not all bad. What we're seeing, the intent of the Feds was to slow the economy down. Everybody will look at 2021 and go, wow, this is getting out of hand. Inflation's getting ready to get crazy because the Feds have pumped so much money into the market. Pull the money back, the leading economic indicators slow down. No different than accelerator pedal. One of the things that I've really pounded during these presentations in recent quarters has been the ship clog in Southern California. And I apologize, this is a busy slide, but this is where I could get the most up-to-date information on the number of ships that are parked out in Southern California. If you'll remember, or if you do recall from previous quarters, this has been as much as 100 ships parked off of the docks in San Diego and in Los Angeles. And what we are finding now that we're getting much, much closer to the number of ships. We had a record high backup of 109 ships January the 9th. And now this is, you can see how dramatically this has dropped down to about 20 ships. So we're beginning to see this part of the supply chain catch back up and get back more to equilibrium. Legislation. Okay. I spent about 4 hours yesterday polishing up the presentation on what's happening in Congress on taxes. And at 5:30 yesterday afternoon, Senator Manchin releases the new Manchin IRA for 2022. So let me tell you what it said and tell you what's happening in Congress from a legislation standpoint. In his release, the Building Back America Act is officially declared dead by Senator Manchin as of yesterday. May it rest in peace. The Secure Act 2.0, we have parts and pieces that may resurrect, but they're not a part of Manchin IRA, which stands for the Inflation Reduction Act. IRA doesn't stand for, in this case, for individual retirement accounts. It's the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So this is what we're now dealing with. Now, one thing we have is that time was running out for the Biden and the Democrats to pass any major legislation before the midterm elections in November. Schumer's been working to get something done before the August recess. Manchin was the stumbling block as the Democrat who couldn't bring all the Democrats to the table. So that's the political backside of how this thing got together. So what have we got in it? We've got a 15% corporate minimum tax. It's going to raise an additional $313 billion per the estimates. Now, all these raising of dollars is over a 10-year period. Keep that in mind. Prescription drug reform, they're saying that's going to increase $2.88 billion. This is part of Medicare dealing with prescription drug costs for Medicare. IRS tax enforcement, go out and collect the money, look for the tax cheats, come up with $124 billion. The carried interest loophole, slow that down, get rid of that loophole from the hedge funds, and the end result is $14 billion in extra revenue. But of course, Congress has to spend it. So you turn around and you're extending the Affordable Care Act for those who qualify. That's going to cost $64 billion. That expires in 2025, by the way. And then we have energy security and climate change dollars that's going to cost 369 billion. And the end result is a deficit reduction of $300 billion, or in what I call real people's terms, $30 billion a year. In all honesty, with the federal budget, $30 billion a year probably gets rounded out. It's small, but it's something that if you're going back during the campaign, you can at least point to. So uh, we expect that this may get through in August, might be September, but with the elections in November, we know there's going to be a lot of activity on the campaign trail and not in DC. So it's likely that Congress is going to spend the next few months debating, negotiating, and during this time, it behooves you as a taxpayer to kind of keep your eye on what's going on out there. A couple of things that did not come up in this, probably the biggest stumbling block is what we call SALT, and that's state and local taxes. That's capitalized at $10,000. And so you've got some states like California, New York, New Jersey with high state income tax that their taxpayers, or their residents rather, can't deduct all the taxes they're paying. This is a major battle going on. So we may see something in that. The second we did not see that impacts many of our listeners and viewers today is the IRA postponement on individual or required minimum distributions. Those items that we had seen before, mostly in Secure Act, are not present in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 that Senator Manchin has gotten behind. So again, stay tuned. This is as up to date as I can get you. This was yesterday afternoon, and so a lot for you to think about. Upcoming for this quarter, inflation. 9.1 isn't going to go to 2.0 in a heartbeat. The Federal Reserve has taken steps to get here, but they got to reduce that 7% to get it to 2.0. That's not, you don't want them to flip the switch because of the impact on the economy. It's going to take time to bring that back down. Is that 2 quarters, 3 quarters, a year and a half? I don't know. I'm not that smart. And as I say, my crystal ball has a cataract. But the reality is you got to drop quite a bit. The whole teeter to this is that you don't want unemployment to get above 5%, because then your economy isn't as healthy. There's no question if we went from 3.6 to 5.0 in unemployment, what that would mean is that some of these people who are looking for good people can now find them. They're in the marketplace. Good employees are probably employed is the key. So it's going to take a lot of finesse and honestly a bit of good luck for the feds to pull this off. So stay tuned. We know that the midterm elections tend to be volatile, and I keep teasing you. I'm going to tell you more about midterm elections in just a minute. So investing in uncertain times, keep in mind the following are not recommendations to buy or sell. They're presented for informational purposes only. So keep that in mind. Okay, let's go back. You've seen this before, but I always come back to this with clients. Every year there's a reason not to buy stocks. So pick the thing that scared you, whatever year that was. Maybe it was 2018. We had the inflationary scare and we had trade wars going on. I don't know what it is, but let's look at reality. And here's the chart of the 48-year average annual return for the S&P 500. We're not going to go individual stocks. We're just going to look at the S&P 500. You see the red, you see the white. We like white, we hate red. Both are a reality. 1973 to 74, the OPEC oil embargo. Thank you, Henry Kissinger. To date myself, this was right when I was coming out of college, but it was also the time when I first started investing in the market. 77, we started double-digit inflation going on. Well, 9.1 is pretty close to double-digit. I don't think we're going to get there. I hope we don't get there. But the reality is it had market impact, and most of us remember the Carter administration. 1981, markets down again. Interest rates were 21%. Okay, let's get real. We're talking 3% today versus 21 in 1981. We got a long way between those two numbers. Unemployment was 7.4, roughly double what it is today. 1990, aftermath of the S&L crisis. Some of you may remember the S&L crisis, some of you may not. But that was what was going on then. 2000, we had Y2K backed up by 9/11, backed up by Enron. Three events which created a horrible period of time for the U.S. economy. 2008, we all remember the Great Recession, and 2018, the Feds raised interest rates, in my opinion, a little rapidly, and the end result was a decline in the market. But as we all know, it's different this time. Well, yes and no. The greater the uncertainty, the more fearful the media reports, the greater the volatility. It's simple math. It can be a rough ride. It has been a rough ride. But keep in mind, historically, the best days in the market generally occur within a couple of weeks after the worst days in the market. But there is always a reason to buy stock. And remember, for every seller, there has to be a buyer. They don't go into a black hole somewhere. In comparison to prior recessions, unemployment's half, interest rates are extremely low. So now, how do the midterm elections impact the market? Well, this is a slide that I absolutely love. Okay, I'm a geek, I admit it. Look at what happens to the market in a typical midterm election year. Now, this election goes back, or this slide goes back to 1962, John Kennedy. So if you can remember back that far, I got people on the screen today who weren't even born then. So if you can go back that far, keep in mind that these are the midterm corrections that have, or the market corrections that happen in the years of midterm elections. Now, has it been a positive result once or twice? How about it's been a positive result every single time? So, you know, I was taught possibility and probability. Again, I'm back to my education, back at JU. And last time I saw, when it happens 100% of the time, historically, then you assume there is a high probability. There's always a possibility, but there's a high probability that the market will rally after a rough start to the year. I give you the chart, you make your own decisions. So the next thing we want to look at is, well, that's cool, Marshall. What about the year after? What happens? You know, you end up with a Republican-controlled Senate, House, whatever. What does that mean to us? So here's your midterm. The blue, Democrat, you got a Democratic president. The red, you got a Republican president. The market, in the Gone with the Wind, frankly, my dear, it doesn't care. What happens is uncertainty is taken away. In other words, the challenge between now and the midterm is what the media is going to tell us on who's going to win and who's going to lose and who's going to have control and who's going to be subjected to the control of the other party, and people get nervous and anxious. Reality is, what I'm showing you on the screen is it doesn't matter. The reality is you get the uncertainty out of the equation and the market responds positively. Here we go again and again. What's happened to the S&P 500, and this takes us back to 2008. Did it matter whether Obama was in office? Did it matter whether Trump was in office? Did it matter whether Biden was in office? Well, maybe too early to tell, because we're in 164 days as of yesterday of a slight downturn in the market. So hopefully, maybe yesterday's speech from Secretary Yellen, from Chairman Powell, will cause the market to bump up. I know we were up early when the market opened. Was the market due for a correction? Absolutely. Again, that's the normal course of the economy. So what should you be concerned about? If you're planning for a lifetime of income, and now we've got an inflationary environment, you got a couple of quick questions. Will your income outlive you, or will you outlive the income? For it to outlive us, our income must grow at least at the rate that our cost of living grows. So how big does your pile need to be? I keep going back to 1973, but if you look back at 1973 and you say, okay, I've got a portfolio and I'm bold. I'm going to put it in 100% equities as measured by the S&P 500. And I'm going to take off 7%. So if I got $1 million, I'm taking 70,000 off, and every year I'm going to increase that 70 by whatever the inflation rate was the previous year, so I don't have to change my lifestyle. If you'd done that at 7%, you'd been broke in 16 years. So if you'd retired at 65, you started retiring and you lived past 81, you got a problem. You overspent, you're out of luck. If you'd done 6% under that formula, you could make it 29 years. So again, let's start at 65, add 29 to it. Last time I checked, that's 94. I'm not sure after the new definitions of recessions and things, but I'm going to go with 94 just for generality. You'd been out of luck. So if you died at 85, fine, your folks inherited something. If you made it to 95, you're a little hungry. If you'd done a 5% withdrawal, that million, after you had lived on it, by the end of 2021 would have been $15 million. It's just basic math, no secrets. But I don't know a lot of retirees that are bold enough to pop 100% of their portfolio in equities. So let's look at a blend. And in this particular blend, this is using stocks and bonds using a 40% bond portfolio. And as you can see, that extends it out 20 years. If you are 65, that gets you to 85 at 7%. And it gets you to 38 years if you're using 6%. But 5% gets you to 12 million. 12 million, 15 million. If you made it that long, you probably don't really care. You're fine and your family's going to be great. So where should I invest now? Here's what we know. Feds just raised the basis points 0.75%. They're expected to do an additional increase later in the year. I know that Chairman Powell waffled on that yesterday, but let's be real for a minute. The economy isn't going to slow that quick. They're going to do an additional increase, and keep in mind with these items as we go through these next couple of slides. When you invest, what's your goal? Well, if your objective is liquidity, then of course you're looking at non-inflationary good items like CDs and cash. Safety, same scenario. Income, well, you might be looking at higher risk bonds, dividend paying stocks. Growth, obviously stocks. And what's your time frame? So let's look at real returns on a couple of things. First one, right now, FDIC insured CDs, you're probably looking at 2.5%. You pay some taxes. If inflation were 2%, your real return is actually a loss of about 1/8 of a point. I use the 2% because that's the target. You plug in the number that you think is correct. The next thing we've got is a dividend paying stock. Dividend paying stock, let's say it's paying 3% dividend, gets a favorable tax rate, 15% instead of 25 that I used on interest as an average. Less inflation, at least you're making money. We don't know what growth is going to be. That may or may not happen depending on the stock. But dividend paying stocks, as we alluded to earlier, are a place that you may want to look at as you're developing your portfolio. So where do you invest? Buy companies, not headlines. If you listen to the press, you'll hear time and time again that, oh, this company is just dead. Nobody's going to buy their products anymore. The reality is the companies that are out there who have large amounts of cash, pay fat dividends, they're okay. Don't be too alarmed. Be an investor, not a trader. An investor's in the market for the long haul. A trader's in there for a short return and get out. Know what you own. Look at every holding in your portfolio to find out what is it that you own. So, that's the important thing, is that you understand what was going on. The other side is to stay in your long-term lane. Don't get confused. Make sure that you stay there. Avoid emotional decisions. Stay calm. Always diversify, diversify, diversify the portfolio and use walking around sense. You know, right now is a great time to take some time to look at your financial independence. What are you doing? Look at the overall plan, check your documents, and make sure you're doing the things that you want to do. So, important stuff for you to consider. I'm not going to belabor that. We do that every presentation. Just tell you, do that checkup on your plan. That's the most important thing you can do right now. You're not going to majorly impact inflation. You're not going to deal heavily with changing unemployment. Do the things that you can do in your own world and take care of your own side of the things. Well, ask the experts. We've had a couple of questions that have come in, and I apologize. Most of the comments have been about the screen. I didn't catch that early enough. I apologize. Hopefully you were able to see the slides in the last part. Do we have any other questions coming in at this moment? Let's see. Patrick, I've got a private one coming in. If you can pick up on there. Let's see.
Absolutely.
Oh, great. I got one, a private message, and the question was, what are some of the best dividend paying stocks right now? I'll let you field that one.
Absolutely. So we do favor dividend payers, and now is a great time to buy them given the general market being on sale. So again, not a recommendation. This is more for informational purposes, but I looked at companies like Home Depot. You've got a company that's down 20% or so this year. Look at that as, hey, I'm buying this at a 20% discount. It yields 2.5%. And that's a story that you can understand as an investor. You could say, look at all these homes that have been sold and bought over the last 5 or 10 years. All these folks have their new homes locked in at a low interest rate. What's the next step after you buy a home? You start spending money on improving that home. Home Depot has a very good track record, consistently paying dividends and returning capital to their shareholders. So we like a story like Home Depot that's really well run, really committed to paying a dividend and going to increase that dividend over the long term. And then you look to other staple companies, things like Verizon, a higher yielder. It yields north of 5% at the moment. It's also down roughly 15% year to date. Very easy to understand what Verizon does. If you have a phone in your pocket, there's a decent chance it's on Verizon's cell phone service. And if there's a room of 30 of us, I'm going to bet that 20 of us have Verizon or use it at home for their internet, for example. And if you walk into most businesses, a lot of businesses are going to use Verizon as well. So there's aspects of the economy that are these large, quality, well-run companies paying a nice yield, and they're on sale right now. There's a long list of them, but those are just a couple highlights that as a consumer, you understand what they do, you participate in that day to day, and as an investor, you can get paid for that pleasure.
Thanks, Pat. Appreciate it very much. So someone just sent me a private message and it's this similar thing. Okay, where do we go for interest right now? If you're a CD investor, the good news is that rates have increased. The bad news is they're still paltry. So you have to look at that at liquidity and security and say, would I be better off if I was looking at bond funds, or how do I step up my risk without taking out long term? I don't want to lock up my money for 5 years or so because I think that the Feds may raise interest rates. And we know that when they raise interest rates, the prevailing rates continue to increase as well. So it's a tough call. Any way you look at it, there is no utopia. And we're going to ride through this part just like we do every other time when we end up with these challenges in the marketplace. With that in mind, if there are any more questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. Let's look at a couple of things. If you know someone who would benefit from our webinar, we'll be offering a recording of today's presentation. And once it's posted, we'll email a link to all who registered for it. Feel free to share with your family and friends. I'll look one more time for any final questions. I don't see any. Our next scheduled event will be our Q3 2022 economic update. This will be held on Thursday, October 27th at 10 a.m. If there are major events that happen between now and then, of course, we'll run a special report like we did last month, trying to keep you informed and aware of the key items that are happening in the economy. I'm sure the Q3 will be interesting. It'll be right before the election, so I'm promising you that there will be some treats, and we'll keep any tricks minimally. So thank you for joining us. I look forward to meeting with you soon. Feel free to send me questions, emails, whatever works for you. But again, thank you so much for attending. Take care.